Hello, welcome once again to Lehto's Law. I'm Steve Lehto. Had several people tell me the funny story and send it over to me about the guy who owns a Ferrari and was posting photographs of it on his social media. And Ferrari sent him some hate mail signed by lawyers. And it raises a bunch of interesting questions, such as once you buy a car, is it really yours? So the answer to that usually is yes. But hey, that could just be me. So I've seen this story several places, including Jalopnik's got a great article. I believe Torchinsky wrote that one. But here is Chris Matuchik. I could be mispronouncing it, and I apologize if I am. But he wrote, a proud Ferrari owner posted pictures of his car on Instagram. Then he says he got a letter from Ferrari's lawyers. Who here needs the reality check? So he says that when you think of Ferrari owner, what do you think of? Because that's really the question. So here is the story of Philip Plein. I could be mispronouncing it, and I apologize if I am, but he spells his last name Plein, Plein. And he loves his Ferrari, or his Ferraris, because apparently he owns more than one. He's a German fashion designer. So keep in mind that German law might be a little different than American law. It's just a guess of mine. I'm not licensed to practice law in Germany. I understand they have laws in Germany, but I think they might be different than ours. But Plein is a German fashion designer who has been quite successful apparently because he's got several Ferraris and he even bought one for his mom. Just what every mom wants, a Ferrari. So he includes these cars in many of the photographs that he posts on his Instagram feed, and it's him and his cars. And he's also posted photographs of his cars with, shall we say, scantily clad models draped upon the cars. But again, the guy's a fashion designer, so you have to understand that his relationship to models and clothing is different than you or I might have a relationship with models and clothing. So the question, of course, is, are the photographs that he's posted on Instagram in bad taste? And if they are, by the way, is that really something that Ferrari can come back at him and say, hey, stop doing that with your car? So Ferrari, of course, is in the news because they wrote a letter. Plein says the car maker's lawyers sent him a rather legalistic piece of hate mail, which is what I call it when lawyers write letters to people, asking him to remove the pictures of his car and to do so within 48 hours. They actually gave him a drop dead. They gave him a deadline, a line in the sand. They gave him a countdown. And so here is what Plein says they wrote to him. Ferrari's trademarks and model cars are associated in your pictures with a lifestyle totally inconsistent with Ferrari's brand perception, in connection with performers making sexual innuendos and using Ferrari's cars as props in a manner that is per se distasteful. So keep in mind that they claim that they have the right to object if you use your Ferrari as a prop in a distasteful fashion. In America, if you buy a product, you can just take it out and smash it if you want to. It's yours. Is there anything more distasteful than just smashing something? And yet you're allowed to do that because it's yours. But let's get back to the other part where he says, the cars and models and so on are associated in pictures with a lifestyle totally inconsistent with Ferrari's brand perception. What exactly is Ferrari's brand perception? And Jason Torchinsky and Mr. Matuchik, and again, I apologize, I could be mispronouncing his name. The man's name is more consonants than vowels. And I'm not kidding. So the question is, what is the perception of the Ferrari brand? What do you think of when you think of Ferrari? Now, I'll admit, I've got some slightly different opinions about Ferrari just because of my own personal life experiences. And however, when I think of, like, let's suppose you say, hey, quick, TMZ is on, there's a guy in a Ferrari. Is your first thought, oh, it's going to be some cultured gentleman idling his Ferrari across the putting green at Pebble Beach? Is that what you... No, that's not what you think of. You think it's going to be some hoodlum who's got too much money out doing something idiotic in a car that you're surprised he can drive because it might have a clutch in it. That's what you think. You don't think, oh, it's going to be taste and refinement. So apparently, Ferrari has a problem with their own perception. They think when they look in the mirror that they see something different than what you or I see when we look at how Ferrari is perceived. So here's the deal. the letter claims that the car maker's brands are tarnished by Pline's pictures, and so Pline himself appears to have not taken that much concern with Ferrari's letters, and he wrote on Instagram, "Can't even put in words how disappointed and disgusted I am about this unfair and totally inappropriate claim against me personally. Obviously, I love cars, and especially Ferrari. I bought my first Ferrari 10 years ago, and recently I bought a Ferrari for my mother as her birthday gift. I think it is absolutely ridiculous as a good client to receive such a letter from a company like Ferrari." But then he left the pictures up. So I suspect that this is a situation where they sent the hate mail hoping he'd respond to it. And his response was kind of like, whatever, and let it go. Now, again, whether they can do something about that in Germany, I don't know. In America, I highly doubt it. The idea that you've got scantily clad women standing next to a product is not demeaning to the product, especially when it's a high-end car. In fact, most guys buy high-end cars like that because that's the fantasy, is that they'll have scantily clad women hanging off the thing somewhere down the road. Doesn't usually happen that way. A lot of guys buy boats for the same reason. But I will tell you my personal Ferrari story, because I have one. I grew up in Birmingham, Michigan. I've mentioned that story before. And Birmingham is in Oakland County. It's north of Detroit. And I lived across the street from a guy who was a very successful automobile executive for one of the big three automakers. And he had in his garage a bright red car. Now, my family moved into that house in 1966 or 67. I think it's 66, making me a very young man. And this guy across the street at one point in time acquired this car. And every now and then you'd see him, he'd push the car out of the garage, and he'd wash it, and he'd wax it, and then occasionally he'd fire it up and drive it around the block. He'd then put it back in the garage by pushing it in the garage, putting a cover over it, and very carefully closing the door. And I found this behavior a little unusual, except I had 5 older brothers, and my father had a convertible that he put in the garage, much with the same care. So I recognized that, oh, this man cherishes this car, but this was not his daily driver. It was a red car, a bright red car. It was a Ferrari red car, but I didn't realize when I first saw the car that that, in fact, was the nickname of that color of the car. And in later years, I heard people tell me, they said, "Oh, by the way, have you seen this man's Ferrari?" And I say, "Yeah, I see it from time to time." He rolls it out, and he either dusts it off, or once a month or so he washes and waxes it, and then I see him drive around the block. And it sounds interesting when he fires it up. And I didn't know at the time that that's because it had a V12 engine in it. And I never got a ride in the car. I walked up a couple times while he was working on it and talked to him and walked around the car. And he told me that it was called a Ferrari GTO. And I was a young man, didn't know much about cars at the time. And in fact, at that time, I worshipped American muscle. So I just thought to myself, oh, it's an Italian car. And he said, well, it's got an Italian handmade body out of hand-hammered aluminum. I thought, that's unusual. Aluminum on a car? A red car? With a V12 engine? And somewhere along the line, I learned it was built the same year I was born. It was 1962. Ferrari GTO. I had no idea. You know, when you grow up and there's things around you, whether they're in your house or in your neighborhood or just nearby or at your workplace, whatever, where you just see something on a daily basis and it becomes part of the background noise of your life. Somewhere in the mid to late 70s, I remember seeing photo shoots on this man's front lawn where they rolled the car out, washed it and waxed it, and then put lights and those big tents, the lighting tents around it and the reflectors, and photographed this thing for calendars. And I remember hearing somebody say, oh yeah, they came by and they photographed his car for a calendar. And I'm like, wow, the guy's car is in a calendar now. No scantily clad models were draped over it, but in fact, there was a calendar photograph taken of this car. And then I remember one year, I believe it was Jay Giles. The Jay Giles band was playing at Pine Knob up in Clarkston, Michigan, north of where I lived. And the day before or after the concert, there was a tour bus parked in front of our house. And I noticed it because it was larger than my house. And later I asked somebody, said, hey, what was that all about? There was a tour bus. And they said, oh yeah, the Jay Giles band stopped by to talk to him about his Ferrari. And later on, I pieced this together. I'm not trying to give you the story purposely disjointed like this, but I want to let you know that's how I learned the story. When I became an older, more sophisticated gentleman around the age of 18, I realized that what my neighbor had was a 1962 Ferrari GTO that he bought fairly inexpensively at the time, but he had done a ton of research on it and discovered it was a factory racer. It was raced by the factory. And somewhere along the line, it had a racing motor put into it by the factory. And when he bought it, I believe this is the story, and you can look this up, it's on the internet. When he bought it, somebody said, oh, the numbers don't match on that motor, so you can have it cheaper. And then later when he got it, he realized that the numbers don't match in the sense of a production car, but they match in the sense of a race car raced by the factory. And people from the factory confirmed that, yes, that 1962 Ferrari GTO was raced by the factory, competed, and now is owned by this guy in Birmingham, Michigan, who then later sold it, I suspect, for more money than I could think of at that time. And since then, 1962 Ferrari GTOs have crossed the auction blocks, extremely expensive auctions, and they are up there in the same range with, like, say, paintings by Van Gogh. I never got a ride in that car. My brother did, but I didn't. And I still remember looking at the car going, it's a neat car. It's an unusual car. Doesn't look like the American-made cars that I worship, but, the body's made out of aluminum. That's cool. It's bright red. It's got a 12-cylinder engine. It's kind of neat, too. Had no idea how cool that car was. Like I said, I never got a ride in it. I saw it driven around the block a whole bunch of times. I saw it being photographed. I saw people, pulling over to look at it. But again, that's my experience with Ferrari. However, what do I think of today when someone says, hey, what about a Ferrari? Well, the first thing I think of is my neighbor's Ferrari GTO. Beautiful car, one of the most beautiful cars ever made. I understand that now. But what do I think about the guys who own Ferraris, other than the guy across the street, who would be the one, by the way, who would, take it to like Pebble Beach or something. But that's not what you think of. That level of sophistication is not what you think of. You think of the guy who's got too much money and is learning how to drive a clutch in a Ferrari. So that's the story with Ferrari. Whether or not this guy's ever going to take down his Instagram photos, I doubt it. In America, that letter would go nowhere. In fact, if I got a letter like that, I'd frame it and make fun of it on Instagram like this guy did, except I don't have an Instagram account. So questions or comments, put them below. Let's talk to you later. Bye-bye.